All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. We're live from Los Angeles, and this is your host, Young Brando. We are going to talk about watches. We are going to specifically focus on the Deloitte report, which is a spotlight in the fashion they do it on the pre owned market. Um, Thank you for your patience. Thank you for tuning in the first place. I'm going to jump into the topic without wasting too much time, but I do want to talk about a few different things before I start. As always, it helps me also warm up my vocal cords, so to speak, and also share with you some of the topics that have been on my mind and some of the um, watches that I posted about some of the stories that I've told on Instagram, which in the same way is at young.brando there, watches and style, of course. This was a post inspired by the Kith runway show that actually took place a few days back in New York, in Manhattan, in front of their newly renovated Manhattan flagship store. They were basically also reintroducing their Kith and Kin collection for the fall winter 2025. And you probably know by now because he did an episode of Talking Watches as well. But the founder and owner of Kith, Ronnie Feig, is a watch guy. He has a pretty decent collection, but this was a watch that he was wearing when he introduced the collaboration with Giorgio Armani, where he had, as one of the talents, the artist Martin Scorsese, which of course is great to have as a model, so to speak. And he was wearing, Ronnie Feig was wearing a pink gold version of the Vacheron Constantin overseas, the 4500V slash 110R dash B705. And you quickly see, of course, that the dial almost looks purple. And that's one of the attributes, so to speak, of that special metallic ink blue dial that Vacheron Constantin has introduced with the third generation of their luxury sports watch, the Overseas, that was unveiled all the way back in 2016. So one might think that there is even, it's almost time for a refresh, perhaps. But one of the ingenious things about it at the time, and that was pretty much well, it was simply not as widespread, let's put it like that. The whole interchangeable strap bracelet system. And I think part of uh, the reason was, of course, that integrated bracelet was the name of the game. That was the fundamental aspect of the design. And I think it took a while for brands to even get over um, that block, that mental block, where straps were merely an option, right? Rather than something that you can easily change into depending on your mood, depending on the occasion, depending even your environment. And of course, with the new Cartier Santos and Vacheron Constantin overseas, about a decade ago now, um, this started becoming something of an industry standard. And I think with all kinds of brands now, from Audemars Piguet to Bulgari, um, within the genre even, it's become more commonplace, and every brand kind of has their proprietary quick change system for straps and bracelets, which has become, again, an industry standard by now. And he is wearing it on what looks like a rubber strap to me, but could be possibly a leather strap as well. And again, I always appreciate your support here. Brian Hoffrey, good evening. Nice to see you too. But it would be nice if you are already on Instagram for you to follow me there and drop a few likes and leave a couple of comments. It always helps to get the ball rolling on these kinds of posts. Also, on that note, I'm live on Kick as well. Not that it matters at this point in time, but if you're using it, please give me a follow there too. It wouldn't hurt to have a viewer here and there, and a little bit of a following. That always that can possibly get the ball rolling on that front as well. Now, I've also shared this image. This was actually the official retirement of Roger Federer. That was in the run-up to the Laver Cup in 2022. There were already rumblings, discussions and rumors about his pending retirement, especially because of niggling injury problems from the last few years, especially. And he announced that he will play the doubles with Rafael Nadal, his, of course, rival, long-term rival and good friend. And he, after they got eliminated, basically, there were these emotional scenes. Of course, I never miss an opportunity to basically bash the Rolex Air King, which is by far one of my least favorite designs of all time, not only in the Rolex catalog. I think the dial looks like a dog's breakfast, or like a spare parts bin of sorts. Of course, I know the story behind it, right? You don't need to educate me. Even though I love the willingness of my audience that learns from me and tries to spit back some of that knowledge on me. So that's a great dynamic. I thrive on that. I know that Rolex had this collaboration with the ongoing attempt at the time in the early parts of this 21st century to break the land speed record, a project that was initially entitled Bloodhound SSC, Supersonic Car, and that practically refers to a car which is driven by a turbojet engine. So Rolex didn't only sponsor the project, but also designed a couple of cockpit instruments. And this style design is actually a pretty faithful rendering of one of those instrument gauges. Of course, it interprets it a little bit, adapts it to a wristwatch dial. You have the 3, 6, 9, which are rendered or filled with luminous material in this particular edition, which is part of the 2022 refresh, the reference 126-900. And you also have around the hour, the minutes marked out by 5-minute intervals. A triangle at 12 o'clock and dashes off yellow, mainly in the coronet, at 12 o'clock, and green, which is both in the Rolex branding and the sweep center seconds hand. And I was basically saying that, the sacrifices the man made for this game, um, being a Rolex testimony, of course, we might think it's all fun and games, uh, that you get to assemble and even stockpile this collection of great contemporary pieces and a lot of interesting vintage watches as well. And God knows, both Roger Federer and his wife Mirka Federer have amassed quite a collection over the years. You still have to once every so often put watches on and go out in public that you don't particularly like. And of course, I'm simply projecting, right? No one knows. But I was thinking that I would also be in tears if I were forced to wear the Rolex Air King in public with so many cameras around. It is an embarrassing scene indeed. But hey, that's when they had refreshed the watch. That's when they had the new reference come out. And Federer then and still to this day is perhaps the most bankable face they have. Emperor Pulpa Meech, 199. The Emperor blesses you. I always thought that Luke was stupid not to join forces with his father and become a part of the empire. So I do appreciate you. And I will try to respond to your question on the Discord at some point, although I'm not very sure how much help I can offer. But in the meantime, I'll just take this chance to tell everybody to hit the like button. The Discord I'm talking about is Aussie Expats Discord, which we use to communicate behind the scenes, so to speak. To access that, it's pretty easy. If Oz is listening, he can drop the link in the chat, of course, because he's a mod on this channel as well. But you can just go to at Aussie Expat Watches, watch a few videos of him, and quickly learn. I think it's in most video descriptions, if not all of them, how you can join that Discord if you so wish. The last one that I will share with you, the last watch and personality or story that I will share with you tonight, is this gentleman, the British actor David Johnson. He had a new profile in GQ Hype with his co-star Cooper Hoffman, who actually happens to be the son of the late Philip Seymour Hoffman. So I had no idea that he had a son, and that son was actually an actor as well. So that's interesting news in and of itself. But the two are leading in an adaptation of the 1979 Stephen King novel, The Long Walk, that is coming out soon, I think this fall certainly, but perhaps already next month. And he was wearing the Cartier Privé Tortue monopusher chronograph. This is the new version, the one that just came out last year in two variations, basically two examples, one in platinum and one in yellow gold, which is the example you see here. Both were made in 200 examples. I'm sure already sold out or at least spoken for, but I thought they were a great way to bring back what remains one of the most elegant designs in terms of producing a classic two-register chronograph. Of course, the case shape may or may not appeal to everybody. It is basically a very specific take on the tonneau, on the barrel-shaped case design. Of course, Cartier has a classic tonneau as well. Tortue literally comes from tortue à pattes, a turtle on its legs. So this is, in a way, a more rounded shape with kind of stubby legs that make up the lugs. What I really like about this is that it is a pretty, in terms of its dimensions, in terms of its proportions, it's a pretty close rendering of the 1998 version, which you can see here on the left side. The right is the new watch. That was the so-called CPCP version, Collection Privée Cartier Paris, that famous conjugation of high horology and classic design that existed between 1998 and 2008. Mostly had offerings of limited runs, short runs, exclusive runs that brought back some strong archival design language from Cartier's bag and mixed that up with elements of high horology. There were, of course, also time-only pieces too, as well as more complicated pieces. There were pieces that were mostly made by the expertise internally available to Cartier. Carole Forestier-Cassapy was, after all, the master watchmaker at that time in Cartier, but also it brought in expertise from outside, from a lot of interesting independent watchmakers who were just making a name for themselves at the time. And the 1998 rendition of the single button Tortue chronograph was actually made with a movement devised for Cartier, conceived for Cartier, and produced for Cartier by THA, Technique Horlogère Appliquée, which was an initiative that actually includes three names: François-Paul Jean, Denis Flageolet of de Béthune, and also Vianney Alter, even though it's only the former two, namely Jean and Flageolet, who worked on this movement that you see on the right, the 045 MC. One of the great things about the new version, the 2024 version, is, of course, they could have simply relied on the established architecture of the earlier movement, which is still available in a slightly modified form from La Joux-Perret, but they didn't do that. They actually designed a new movement, which is very old school in its architecture, hand-wound, and actually quite thin as well, which allows this watch to remain roughly in those same proportions. The dial is a little different. I think reflects more of the vintage inspiration. Of course, some might lament the disappearance of the rosette guilloche design. Nevertheless, I think the general aesthetics remain in line with that Roaring '20s inspiration. 1920 MC, after all, is the name of the caliber, and 1928 is the date when Cartier actually unveiled its first Tortue chronograph. I thought that was pretty cool. It's pretty cool to see it on someone's wrist for a change, because a lot of these Cartier limited editions, unless you are already in the books, unless you're already a VIP client for Cartier, are even hard to handle, right? They don't really bring them out um, to anyone who walks in, claiming at the very least that they don't even make it to boutiques unless it is for someone who is allocated the watch. All right, so let's dive right in to uh, what is our primary topic for the night, which is the Deloitte report on the pre-owned market. Um, just to be clear, this is the 2024 report, right? It's not anything new. Um, but you guys know that before I picked up things again um, on YouTube, I was absent for months, basically, without any live stream, without any other kind of involvement. So I didn't really have time to talk about it. One thing I really like about Deloitte's reports on the Swiss watch industry is that they take the form of what they call a spotlight. So rather than relaying more of a broad and at times raw information and statistics and numbers that, for example, the Morgan Stanley report does, they usually have a larger heading, a particular focus where the report tries to provide a series of insights. So last year's insights for reports that were actually mostly published this year, or at least I think this one was published earlier this year. First, it was the spotlight on India, which, of course, is probably the most important emergent market. And you see there is also an interesting shift towards India, not only as a market, but also as a site of manufacture as well. Um, I'm sure you have heard the news about Apple iPhone 17 and how every single example of it, every single unit of it that is going to make it to the United States is actually going to come from India. It's going to be made in India anyway. So spotlight on India, because India is important for our early 21st century geopolitical focus, and also about the emergent middle class aspiring to luxury watches. And the second spotlight was on the female market. The third spotlight, which is our topic today, is on the pre-owned market. And Deloitte was one of the first of such companies, such that produce these kinds of reports that paid attention to the secondary market. At the beginning, and they are pretty transparent here, when they first started talking about the secondary market in earnest, which was back in 2020, they were simply exploring it as a new avenue for luxury Swiss manufacturers to move in, to explore, to perhaps invest in. But they were also one of the first, Deloitte was one of the first to predict, and by now we can say forecast, the eventual eclipse of the primary market by the secondary market, meaning that by the next decade, possibly as early as 2030, the secondary market will supersede the primary market. There will be more watches bought and sold on the secondary market than watches being bought and sold on the primary market, which I think is very, very interesting indeed. Yeah, Hoffrey, Ryan. I'm sorry, but when I'm talking about something specific, I don't pay attention to the chat, especially when it takes the topic so far away from our focus, unless it's a super chat, right? I do everything for money, basically. So it's that should be pretty transparent. So if you're dying to discuss something, just throw in a super chat and I will be happy to change tracks. But until that happens, we are talking about the pre-owned market, and specifically the insights produced by the Deloitte Spotlight. Now, I just started by talking about how it is the part of the watch market that is growing fastest, with a potential to take over, to supersede the primary market in the next 10 years. Within the next 10 years, that's the global interest, the global consumer interest in pre-owned watches has doubled since they first started this, since, pardon me, that is 2020, right? And that seems to be pretty much across the board, right? All kinds of consumers, not only Gen Z, right? The interest on the secondary market is not a Gen Z exclusive phenomenon by any means. Of course, some part of this interest on the secondary markets is propelled by an interest in vintage and neo-vintage watches, which have been, at least in the earlier years of our existence, this hobby's existence and growth in online spaces, right? Arguably, we can say an interest in independent watchmaking and high horology writ large has taken over the previous hype on vintage and neo-vintage watches, or rather for vintage watches, let's say. But we will talk about how the category of neo-vintage as well as independent watches continue to figure in discussions about the secondary market, in the growth of interest on the secondary market as well. They're also paying attention to the fact that as the secondary market matures, there is an increasing number of CPO programs, and their definition of these certified pre-owned programs, of course, includes the ones that are led by the brands themselves, right? By the number of um, luxury Swiss makers that have, in fact, uh, more or less recently established their own CPO programs, but also Deloitte uses the term to refer to methods of certification, inspection, servicing, and authentication that are used by third, it's kind of tertiary platforms, let's say very quickly, marketplaces such as Chrono24 or even eBay. Their next point, of course, and this is one of the most timeless things about the secondary market, about the market of pre-owned watches, that they're seen as a bargain for 1 in 5 consumers. Of course, we have to keep in mind that that truism about the pre-owned market allowing you a possibility of bargain has given way to treating the secondary market as a more expedited way and potentially more accessible way of entering the watch market more broadly, right? Where a lot of the more desirable pieces are not available or immediately accessible through traditional points of retail. They are, in fact, available on the secondary market, even if they carry a certain, a significant premium oftentimes. And to loop back into that discussion of independent watchmakers, right? The more people are interested in independent watchmakers, of course, the more there are people who expect the same kind of instant gratification from that particular category of watches made by independent makers. And of course, the secondary market provides a shortcut for that too, right? For a piece that for which you might have to wait a year, 2 years, sometimes up to 7 years or a decade. If you are willing to pay the price, you might have access to these kinds of pieces by tomorrow, shipped overnight to your door through the secondary market. The best of two worlds, which means basically that the advent of the brands themselves entering the secondary market through certified pre-owned programs instills a certain trust and reliability into the secondary market. Now, you guys know from a few weeks back now, maybe already a month ago, I had a reassessment of the Rolex CPO program, and I was always quite skeptical towards it, but I guess my latest assessment was outright cynical, and I was really questioning the very purpose of existence for a Rolex certified pre-owned market. And ultimately, I was making the argument that it is not necessarily inaugurated to help the customer or with the customer in mind, but really it is a vehicle for Rolex to take their share of the pie, of the added value generated by the secondary market, but also it is a way for Rolex to appease their established network of retailers who find themselves hard done by, again, because they are finding themselves between a rock and a hard place, so to speak, where they would either have to operate completely according to the book and not uh, be able to officially uh, take a piece of that pie, have a share of that value generated by the secondary market, or else, in fact, engage in all sorts of backdoor deals to then enter that gray market in their own terms, which would, in fact, threaten their entire existence as an authorized dealer. Before, without veering completely into that path, I want to say, beyond my personal skepticism and even cynicism, um, I cannot ignore the fact that for the average consumer, for people who enter the market for luxury watches um, more recently, they are looking for ways of assuaging their fears and um, getting that peace of mind. And a lot of them are willing to pay extra for it, willing to pay quite a bit of a premium for it to um, to buy that peace of mind. So CPU actually works, right? We can still express our misgivings and um, suspicions even about the particular practice of specific CPO programs, Rolex's CPO program being, I think, one of the more important examples, if only in terms of volume. But that doesn't mean that it does not generate value for the brand in tapping into um, this market of consumers who want to buy from the brand directly, want that watch here and now, and are willing to pay the premium for it. And then they are talking about how the businesses and brands have roughly three different ways of establishing inventory, right? Either they're running a marketplace or holding third-party inventory in consignment or own pre-owned inventory themselves. And of course, there are certain businesses uh, who do a little bit of all, you know, all three, so to speak, all of the above. Now, the first few figures, I think, do a very good job of establishing in a very objective way through the uses of analytics, through data made available through watch charts and chronopulse specifically, the ebbs and flows of the secondary market, the evolution specifically of pre-owned markets prices from watch charts overall market index, right? And you can see how the prices have started picking up from January 21st, have reached a certain all-time high mid-year in 2022 and have more or less then come all the way down to those 2021 levels already by the end of last year. And in the Chronopulse market index, you have a similar trend, except, of course, the prices seem to have have stabilized at a slightly higher rate than they were pre boom, pre slash post pandemic boom. And I think overall that's certainly the case, right? We have perhaps at this particular moment with the new tariffs and discussions and contentions around the issue of tariffs for Swiss watches, we certainly have uh, this brief period. We are inhabiting a period where there are too many moving pieces, where we might have to wait and see how things are going to develop. But overall, the trend has been that the prices have stabilized, not necessarily uh, come all the way down to levels uh, they were before the pandemic. However, they seem to have more or less come down to the same level they were um, right at the beginning of the pandemic, more or less. They seem to have come back down to the 2021 levels, and I think that's actually a pretty realistic way of looking at the long-term oscillations of prices, right? I think it's quite unrealistic for at least the more aspirational watches. It's quite unrealistic to expect those aspirational watches to come all the way down to the levels where they were um, before the pandemic boom, because now you have a more globalized, wider, bigger base of clients. You have simply more people who are in this hobby, more people who are willing to spend unconscionable amounts of money on watches, and simply more people who have some sort of knowledge about those iconic, aspirational, or desirable watches, whether we are talking about brands more broadly or specific models. So, for every watch sold, you simply have more competition now than you have ever had, and that's not really going to go away, right? Flippers and other sorts of profiteers and investors may have moved away from the market to a large extent, since the opportunity to make a quick buck has more or less disappeared. Uh, but there is now a much different demographic of buyers and a broader base of consumers in the watch market in general. And if anything, that's going to actually increase in time. I don't think many more of these people are ever going to completely move away or migrate away from uh, the market of watches, whether we are talking about the primary market or the secondary market. Well, the point of this particular piece of research is to say that the secondary market is more important. And this is something they pay very specific attention to, entrance of the entrance into the scene of the celebrity collector. And of course, that was already part of the trend. Right? There's a reason that one of the most popular genres of content, of horological content ever produced, is the Talking Watches series by Hodinkee. Right? There's always been this sort of mythology of the celebrity collector, who is also in a way relatable and approachable. However, I think it has simply become more commonplace now to see not only the latest, newest, and shiniest pieces on the wrists of the celebrities, but increasingly the kinds of rare, obscure, and vintage pieces that some of us watch idiot savants aspire to. And with that also came the ability and willingness on the part of those celebrity clients to invest on the watch market. And the two prominent examples, of course, are the elite athletes who have made investments in Chrono 24, for example. Cristiano Ronaldo invested in Chrono 24, and he was later joined by Charles Leclerc, the Formula One driver, pardon me, the Monegasque driver for Scuderia Ferrari. Of course, Michael Jordan, Giannis Antetokounmpo, let's just say Giannis. I'm not very good at pronouncing his last name, who have invested in the 916 company as well. And of course, even though the company is now sold to Watches of Switzerland, you will remember that in the past, there was an investor group with a significant stake at Hodinkee, which included people like Tom Brady, John Mayer, and also the LVMH luxury group as well. They're talking about the growth of the certified pre-owned market, right? Which is of course not necessarily something entirely new, right? Even when it comes to the marketplaces and dealer networks that have offered this service, right? Bukhara always had their own certified pre-owned program. I think, let me see. Right, the 1916 company, formerly Watchbox, has had a CPO program for more than a decade, since 2014. Watchfinder, which has been bought by Richemont in 2018, has had its certified pre-owned program since 2007, so on and so forth. But of course, the most important development in terms of the CPO market has been how a lot of brands are now increasingly more reluctant to leave that space, leave the CPO market to other players. They are, in fact, exploring and, in fact, mounting strategies to claim this market for themselves. Of course, Rolex's introduction or Rolex's rollout of a CPO program was basically the biggest sign that pretty much every single significant player in this market was going to follow finally in the footsteps of Rolex and of other brands in establishing their own CPO programs. Some of these so-called CPO programs focus squarely on vintage watches for the most part, but Rolex's program, for example, has a lot of contemporary models, in fact, right? One of the points that provoked or that initiated my earlier discussion was that Rolex now, in fact, considers even watches that are at least 2 years old prime for inclusion in their CPO program. So it's pretty much open right now, and that was why I am so skeptical about. Well, I mean, I shouldn't say skeptical because that implies other things, and we can talk about those other things too when we dedicate our discussion, as I did with the Rolex CPO program, to the discussion of specific brand CPO programs. But in this particular case, I will just say I'm generally cynical, right? To me, the most important purpose, the primary motivation for these certified pre-owned programs by the brands themselves is simply to make sure, one, how do we get our well-deserved piece of this pie? How do we get our share of this added value generated in our name on the secondary market? And the more diplomatic way of posing that problematic or formulating that intention is also quite rightful, right? In the sense that, hey, the sale of our watches on the secondary market, which is sooner or later going to overtake the primary market, is being decided, at least in part, by the sale of our watches on the secondary market. We have to do something to protect our brand equity, protect the value of our watches by being involved ourselves on the secondary market, which I think all of this is fair enough, right? There's nothing wrong with these brands feeling entitled to make money on the watches they produce, right? In fact, the perverse thing would be to ask them to not be involved at all. This is very interesting, right? Questions asked to the brands themselves. Right? 36% of the industry executives are planning to invest in their own platform. Roughly a third of them, at 34%, have no plan to move to CPO. 26% provide the certification for their own brands, vintage and CPO watches. 23% have a white label partnership with an existing platform, with an existing CPO program. And again, talking about Rolex's acquisition of Bukhara, which has had one of the longest running CPO programs themselves, can be understood in this way as well, right? People have often thought about the Rolex acquisition of Bukhara in gaining access to more than 100 retail locations worldwide, and therefore gaining the ability of establishing their own boutiques and basically activating the possibility of Rolex becoming a boutique-only brand themselves, I can't personally deny that they have some measure of willingness in opening more brand operated boutiques. But for Rolex, I think that can only be a very long term objective, if at all possible. Right? I still don't believe that they want to forsake. I still don't believe they want to let go of their time honored partners in local jewelers worldwide. Um, However, in terms of gaining control of the secondary market, pardon me, in terms of having a worldwide um, physical and also possibly electronic presence of Rolex with a direct involvement on the secondary market with the sale of their CPO watches, which already start with 2-year-old pieces. They have great resources. They have invested in some very useful infrastructure with um, the acquisition of Bukhara. So white label partnership with an existing platform for CPO, 23%. Launch own branded CPO business or manage multi-brand CPO, 13%. Acquire an existing one, 0%. The Deloitte report pays particular focus onto Rolex's program as a fast rising one. As an example, now they're also talking about the different kinds of products that figure into the making of the secondary markets. Of course, comparison shopping. They highlight comparison shopping and how the possibility of finding a bargain remains one of the unique appeals of pre-owned watches. Affordability. But perhaps just as important, if not more, is the ability to buy pieces that are, for the lack of a better word, unique, right? Watches that have been long discontinued, watches that have been rarely made in limited numbers, exclusive editions, limited production. The secondary market, of course, for the buyer who is equipped with a certain kind of knowledge, provides perhaps the best possibility to access those watches. Right? In fact, the only possibility, really. They pay a particular focus to independent watchmakers and new vintage watches. Again, I have mentioned that the ability for, well, the possibility of instant gratification, right? The ability to buy some of these independent makers' creations immediately without having to wait for a year, for 2 years, for 7 years, up to a decade, perhaps longer. If you're willing to pay the piper, so to speak, you are able to acquire one of those watches. The neo vintage pieces and their particular appeal is underlined, is emphasized by Deloitte's reports, by Deloitte's spotlight on the pre-owned markets, because they bring together elements of classical design and craftsmanship with the functionality and wearability that we expect from a contemporary wristwatch, right? A neo-vintage piece, by the way, or by the mere fact that it's stood the test of time, can be an expression of timeless elegance, can be a testament to classical design, but it is often, because it is produced with emergent modern methods, it is often a watch that's just as practical, just as wearable, just as sturdy, nearly as robust as any contemporary timepiece. So that sweet spot is an important category, is an important segment in the secondary markets for sure. And this is something that they highlight, that they underline. And this is an interesting parallel, which I don't necessarily co-sign, but Deloitte basically makes a parallel between neo-vintage pieces that you can acquire in the pre-owned market and the quite luxury pieces that you can acquire in the apparel market, right? So neo-vintage watch would be the counterpart to a cashmere sweater from Brunello Cucinelli, let's say. I'm not sure if I necessarily subscribe to that parallel, though I see the logic behind it, right? You know, it's basically a very conscious participation in the luxury market without necessarily buying into the trappings of the luxury retail experience, right? Even though, again, the brands are doing everything possible, everything in their hands to integrate the secondary markets into that luxury retail experience. But at least as it is now, consciously seeking out, consciously curating, consciously going after a studied neo-vintage piece can be likened in the parallel that Deloitte draws here to consumption of so-called quite luxury pieces in the apparel market. And they go a little bit into the demographics, and that is mostly in terms of ages and generations of the consumers on the secondary markets. I personally didn't find that information so revelatory or important. If you can gain access to the report on your own, feel free to explore that on your own time. But of course, they pay attention there about to how a lot of the buyers today, a lot of the players in the market for luxury watches simply don't like to wait, right? And a lot of the luxury consumers also don't like being told that something is not available, that something is not for purchase, that it is for exhibition only, that people don't like being told, especially if they have the money, that they can't buy something. So For that particular mentality, the secondary market, of course, presents a great target of opportunity. And again, although we can't necessarily divide the primary and secondary market in terms of an in-store retail experience and online purchasing, right? Things don't um, line up so tidily to a binary opposition like that. Uh, we have to say, or we have to admit, that at least some of the recent growth of the secondary market, which is sustained in significant parts by these third-party marketplaces, has a lot to do with the kind of convenience that younger generations associate with online shopping, right? And Deloitte pays particular attention to Gen Z with a strong inclination towards online purchasing, with 55% indicating that they prefer to shop online, whether it is new or pre-owned pieces, in fact. They talk about those three categories of sellers, again, keeping in attention that um, these three types can overlap, right? Whether a seller has their own stock, whether they mainly uh, sell pieces that are consigned by third parties, or whether they simply offer a marketplace that connects buyers to sellers. They're talking, of course, about the role of the seller in the digital world and how much that plays into um, the health and trustworthiness of online marketplaces, and how, in the absence of face to face interactions, those marketplaces have to establish systems of demonstrating, one, their own credibility, but also um, to put checks in place where buyers and sellers can verify each other through reviews, ratings, testimonials. Um, and of course, we cannot neglect the fact that a lot of these platforms, such as Chrono24 and eBay, not to mention, RiskCheck and Bezel, uh, offer their own services of authentication and certification as well. They talk also about the role of auction houses, which perhaps have the necessary infrastructure in curating and propagating that kind of uh, experience, expertise, and even credibility. How they also serve, um, or they also rather, um, how shall I put this, bank on the feeling of exclusivity and prestige as well. And finally, in their conclusion, they talk about how, again, how quickly things have been transformed, where Deloitte themselves were paying little attention before 2020 to the pre-owned market. And in less than 5 years, here we are, where we are already forecasting that the pre-owned market will soon supersede, will soon take over the primary market as the center of focus, as the center of volume. And I think they're absolutely right. Again, despite my own misgivings about particular CPO initiatives, um, whether it is a symptom or a cause, the advent of brand supported and propagated CPO programs certainly announces a new era where the consumers are looking for more transparency and trust. So the ability to certify, to authenticate, to basically earn that trust remains crucial, whether we're talking about the brands themselves or the marketplaces which interface these transactions. And they repeat in closing that their expectation is that within the next 10 years, the secondary market will be as large as the primary one. Again, thank you so much for listening to me. I don't know what's going on, but I have a lot of pain in my throat. Pause. So I will have to cut this relatively short. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to answer your questions, but you know the rules in the first place, right? It's I can only do so much for free when I give so much of my time, so much of my labor, so much of my own knowledge to share with you on Instagram and here on a daily basis. I think I deserve some, some support, and that includes, of course, your contributions as well. So next time, if you want, if you have a burning question, if you want me to answer something specific, tailored to your requests, please understand that this is my business, that I make a living on this, right? So as much as I try my hardest to sustain this platform as an independent voice, that much I depend on your contributions to keep it afloat, keep it alive, in fact. So, in the absence of that, obviously, I can't do a more free flowing conversations. I have to base my content to a certain extent based on certain pieces commissioned by people who still belong to my audience, but who at least recognize what I do with putting their money where their mouth is, so to speak. So I hope you appreciate that. In the absence of that, please at least hit the like button. Leave a comment or two after the video concludes, which I don't see much of, actually. And that greatly disappoints me as well. But that being said, at least hit the like button, leave a comment or two. Follow me also on Instagram if you are not already. That helps as well. Share the link with other watch collectors and enthusiasts and help me grow this community that comes together around passion for and knowledge of wristwatches. And with that, I will leave you for tonight. I think I'll come back on Friday, and I will certainly be here on Saturday night as well. Again, with a more focused discussion. One of those nights will be dedicated to the references and auction results, with the link posted quite soon. You will know by tomorrow latest what that's going to be. Until then, until the next one, stay safe, stay healthy, wear and enjoy your watches. Goodbye.